So, good day, everyone, and welcome to iTelescope, another wonderful webinar. It's the 1st of March. It's going to be spring soon. It's so exciting. And today we have a marvelous topic. It's all about life. Is there anything out there? I would like to introduce to you Dr. Rachel Phillips from the University of South Carolina, from the geology department there, or I think to be more precise, it's called, let me just read this up, School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. She's a doctor of philosophy, recently obtained her degree, so congratulations on that. Very well
Thank
done.
you.
And she's got this marvelous YouTube channel called GeoGirl. I'll put the link in for you. It has 50,000 subscribers and 278 videos. I can tell you these are top class, and it's amazing what audience she has drawn and popularized this very difficult subject to such an extent. So I would like to welcome to you Dr. Rachel Phillips. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much. Oh, I see some familiar followers in the chat. Thank you guys for coming. I hope this will be a great talk. Well, thank you so much for introducing me with that very kind introduction. It still sounds weird to hear doctor, but I love
You
it.
deserve it all the way.
Okay, well, should I go ahead and share my screen and get started then?
Please go ahead. Yes.
All right, awesome. Oh, that's hopefully that won't go off too much. Okay. So can you see that?
We can. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I will be talking today about how studying Earth's past, Earth history, helps us to search for life on other worlds, specifically with examples in our solar system. But that's just because I don't know really that much about exoplanets, but I'm sure there's applications there too. Like Dr. Sassy said, I am a postdoc. Well, I just got my doctorate. I'm a postdoc at University of South Carolina. And yeah, I have a channel on YouTube where I talk about all things geoscience, including all the things we'll talk about today. And so I have a link about of that at the end on the last slide if you're interested. But without further ado, I will get started. So I will start the talk by talking about kind of the tools that we use to study Earth's past, kind of the way that we look into the past. Spoiler alert, it's all about rocks. And then I will talk about how we can apply the same concepts or the same tools to study other worlds or rocks on other worlds specifically. And then with each kind of tool that I'll introduce, I'll also go through examples that we can think about in our own solar system of planets and moons that we can use these on. So first things first, how do we study Earth's 4.55 billion year history? There are, measurements that we can take with, getting environmental and climatic parameters today, but humans only go back so far. So how do we study past climatic and environmental conditions before humans were around to take those measurements? Well, thankfully, rocks were around to take the measurements for us, and rocks preserve something called proxies, or physical, chemical, and biological signatures. Sorry, I'm just going to move this little thing with my head so I can read my slide. Physical, chemical, and biological signatures in rocks, which help us to reconstruct ancient climate and oceanic conditions, because these signatures form under very specific conditions. And I'll give a bunch of examples as we go through. So essentially, we can compare our proxy-based reconstructions of past conditions using rocks with instrumental records that we have as far back as we can go with instrumental records to improve our ability to reconstruct pre-human conditions. And so this is kind of one of our ways of calibrating these proxy-based or rock-based reconstructions. And essentially, yes, these data that we have using rocks and proxy reconstructions help us and can be applied to studying planetary science and looking for life on other worlds. But it's also really important that we study Earth's past just to study modern Earth and future potential Earth conditions, because our understanding of how Earth's chemical cycles and climate currently operates and how it might fluctuate in the future really relies on our understanding of how all the systems have evolved on Earth to become what they are today. So that's another major application of studying Earth's past. So I will be talking today about the three types of proxies, of signatures in the rock record that we use to reconstruct Earth past, and then go through each example, physical, chemical, and biological, with examples of how we can apply these to looking at other rocks that are floating out there in space. So the first one, physical proxies, essentially form because climate change and climate and environmental fluctuations can physically alter sediments in very predictable ways. Parameters like sediment texture, structure, color, density, magnetism, and composition can be used to study past environmental conditions. Sorry, my cat just jumped up on the table. So if you hear her, that's just ignore her. One example that I'd like to focus on is structure. So texture and structure are different in geology just by scale. Texture is like small scale grains, like grain roundness or angularity in the rock. But structure we can use to look at very large scale kind of major rock deposit or outcrop features. Like on this picture here, we see this huge outcrop of this massive sandstone with these lines in it. And in that picture, these lines are what we call cross beds. And this is a large scale structure that we can actually use to determine that these deposits were made in a desert environment. This is sandstone that was deposited as dunes, which preserved as these lines, these slanted sloped lines. And because we know the depositional environment that this was formed in, we know that the wind was traveling to the right of the screen from this orientation because of the slope of those crossbeds. And so this is just one example of ways that we can determine things about the past environment from rocks on Earth. And so not only is this applicable to desert environments, but essentially structure of rocks can tell us whether rocks were deposited in land or water, and what direction the water or land was taking those grains, and the energy levels of that system. And one perfect example of where we can use structure to study potential for life on other worlds is with Mars. Mars's surface has ripple marks and channels along its surface that indicate to us that liquid water once flowed on Mars's surface. And right now it's all frozen due to Mars's current conditions, but the potential for past liquid water to have flowed across Mars's surface is huge for the potential of life on Mars, or ancient life on Mars. And so that kind of keeps us coming back to looking in the rocks for potential life signatures. And we'll get to some of what we might look for there in later slides. But that's just one of the ways that we can look for large scale structures that might indicate the presence of life on other worlds, or at least the past presence of life. One great example, and one of my favorite examples, of a world in our solar system that has amazing large-scale physical structures that could help us look for life is Europa. Europa is a moon of Jupiter that has a liquid water ocean covered by icy crust. And it has a surface, which, as you can see, essentially looks like it's been scribbled all over. And that just means that it has tectonics going on. It's got major tectonic activity going on somehow in that ice crust, making these external features that look like scribbles. And that can tell us a lot about the history of the moon and its potential for life. For example, Europa has tensile structures on its surface, structures that we've identified to be kind of extensionary. They are parts of the ice that have pulled apart or look like they pulled apart. They also have compressional features where it looks like the ice is pushing together, making certain features, and shear features where it's kind of rubbing against each other. These are all the same types of tectonic features that we have on Earth. Hold on, let me just check the chat. Okay, good. But yeah, so these are all the same types of features we have on Earth, the three types of kind of tectonic boundaries. And so it is possible that on Europa, there are some sort of similar tectonic processes occurring, just like those on Earth. And so when we study those on Earth, we can kind of then go and interpret those on other worlds like Europa. I'm going to talk about a couple examples that are the most, in my opinion, interesting with regards to Europa's surface, starting with, okay, the slide's not changing, there we go, starting with dilation bands. These are essentially features on Europa that are analogous to mid-ocean ridges or moors on Earth. So on Earth, we have plates, tectonic plates, that spread apart in the ocean and allow magma from the mantle to come up and form new crust. And these we call mid-ocean ridges. And just like that, on Europa, there are dilation bands which are raised relative to surrounding plains and have consistently spaced lineaments that suggest constant dilation or expansion episodes and potentially new crust coming up and forming new kind of ice magma coming up and forming new ice crust at the surface. So essentially something like a mid-ocean ridge, but with an icy mantle rather than a rocky mantle, which isn't that out there because like our interior of Earth is rock, but there are parts that are more molten or plastic and can be, obviously allow convection in the mantle and drive tectonics at the surface. Just like that, the icy, crust of Europa could have regions that are more plastic and ductile and can allow, ductile molten upwelling of icy like magma that comes up to form new crust. And this could be really important for nutrient cycling on Europa. What do I mean by this? Well, we have to kind of end the cycle with subsumption bands, which are also potentially present on Europa, which are analogous to subduction zones on Earth. So on Earth, we have mid-ocean ridges that form new crust, expanding crust, and then that kind of ends the cycle where it comes to subduction zones, where crust is recycled back into the mantle because denser crust sinks under less dense crust, and that recycles the crust back into the mantle. And so on Europa, this might also be happening where denser ice plates, if you will, subduct under less dense ice plates due to differences in salt content, which kind of cycles the ice back into the kind of molten ice mantle-ish thing. And that is really crucial for life because this allows some sort of cycling of surface material down to the ocean and back up. And that's really important because if the liquid water ocean on Europa is just closed in by ice completely and is not is just a closed system and doesn't have this cycling, then the chemicals that allow life to harness them for energy in the ocean would just all be used up and then done for. They wouldn't be replenished. So this cycling could allow some sort of replenishment of those chemicals for the ocean. Should I wait till the end to answer questions, or should I answer them as
I,
we go?
it's completely up to you, but I would recommend to wait to the end because we'll put it in
Okay.
the Q&A and then it's more focused, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think that'll be good. Okay. Yeah, so this could allow cycling to kind of feed or replenish the reactants that life needs in Europa's ocean. This could be really important. However, it might not be all that necessary if Europa has hydrothermal activity at its sea floor, which is kind of like underwater volcanism, similar to hydrothermal activity on the deep sea floor of Earth, where we see these amazing ecosystems. And that I'll actually wait to talk about till we get to a different moon in our solar system named Enceladus. And so I have a later slides about that because that is super important for what we call water rock interactions, which might also allow kind of this replenishment of chemicals that life can use for energy. So we'll talk about that as we get into chemical proxies, because that leaves behind chemical proxies that we can find. So chemical proxies are the next type of proxy or signature in the rock record that we use to study Earth's past and also, look for life on other worlds. These can be very direct or indirect. Direct ones can be things like gases trapped in ancient minerals like ice bubbles or bubbles in amber or in halite, rock salt. And essentially, we can measure these to get a direct measurement of ancient atmospheric chemistry or the kind of chemistry of the atmosphere at the time that rock formed, where that rock formed. However, most chemical proxies, like the ones that I studied for my PhD research, are a little bit more indirect. In other words, they're just chemical compounds within, or kind of certain types of chemical compounds within rocks that, when preserved, indicate that there must have been some sort of specific temperature, pressure, pH, or other chemical condition that their formation required. For example, for my PhD research, I studied certain compounds in rocks that only got preserved in those types of rocks when water was very anoxic or was very low in oxygen concentrations. So when we found those signatures, we knew, okay, that water in that region at that time was poorly oxygenated. There was very low oxygen levels, if any. And so these are kinds of chemical proxies that we can use to reconstruct very specific parameters of past, mostly oceans, which we can then extrapolate to atmospheres. And this is because ocean chemistry controls marine shell and rock composition. And so when we look at the chemistry of rocks and shells, these can be proxies for temperature, pH, salinity, oxygen concentrations, all of those parameters, depending on what chemical we're looking at in the rock or shell and the type of rock or shell and its composition as a whole. And I'll talk about some examples in a slide in a second. But one other reason that shells in particular and skeletons are really great for looking for chemical signatures is because things like corals and mollusks that secrete skeletons made up of calcium carbonate, like limestone rock, they often secrete sequential layers like annual growth or seasonal growth layers, which can help us provide us seasonal or very precise timing information of the fluctuations going on at that time. So that's another reason we really like to look at shells. Another reason is because when we know the species, or at least the larger group of organism we're looking at, we also know where kind of in terms of environment we're looking. And so, for example, we can say, okay, if we're looking at an ancient coral, we know that we're reconstructing a parameter of probably a shallow, warm marine environment, since that's where corals like to be. So we can also get an idea of the environment and then the climate in that region. And the way or the specific chemical or chemical signature we like to look for within these rocks and shells tends to be stable isotopes, or that's like the big one that is so useful. And I'm going to explain in the next couple slides, hopefully in very plain language, why these are so useful. So isotopes are a scary word, but they're very simple. Isotopes are just atoms of the same element that have different number of neutrons and thus a different mass. So, for example, carbon-12 and 13. Carbon-12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, and carbon-13 has 6 protons and 7 neutrons, given, we say 13 rather than 12. And these are stable isotopes of carbon, which are different than radioactive isotopes in that they don't decay over time. So we use radioactive isotopes like carbon-14, which decay over time to date rocks because they act as like clocks. They decay after the rock forms. They start to decay over time at a constant rate, and we can measure ratios using them to get at what the age of the rock is. But stable isotopes like carbon-13 and 12 don't decay over time, so their ratios remain constant with regards to their total Earth concentration ratios on Earth. But what's great is that we can take the ratio of carbon-13 over 12, for example, in rocks of different systems and get an understanding of paleoclimate or ancient climate, because climate change alters the distribution of stable isotopes throughout different Earth systems. So in other words, stable isotopes, fractionate or distribute themselves differently in different Earth systems depending on their mass. Again, because they have different numbers of neutrons, their mass changes, and this changes the way that they are distributed throughout environments. For example, oxygen-16 is 2 neutrons lighter than oxygen-18. So when water from the ocean evaporates, a lot more of the water that's evaporating is enriched in oxygen-16 relative to 18, because lighter water will evaporate sooner than heavy water will. And so most of the stuff in the atmosphere, the oxygen in the atmosphere, or the O and the H2O, is lighter oxygen, whereas most of the the oxygen in the water in the ocean is more enriched in oxygen-18. It's heavier. And so this is one example of how isotopes fractionate through different systems. Another example, and the example that I'll use to talk about how we can use chemical proxies on other worlds, is carbon isotopes. And essentially, the way that carbon isotopes fractionate, or one major way that they fractionate, is carbon-12 is preferentially taken up by photosynthesizing organisms. In other words, photosynthesizers like trees preferentially take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that contains lighter carbon-12 rather than the heavier carbon-13. So carbon-13 to 12 ratios in plants and organic carbon deposits are much lighter, are much more are lower, are enriched in carbon-12 compared to inorganic carbon material like limestone or carbonates. And so organic carbon deposits contain lower carbon-13 to 12 ratios than carbonate deposits, inorganic carbon deposits. And so when inorganic carbon deposits, the carbon isotope ratios in them rise or fall on a global scale, and we can measure this throughout the rock record in Earth's history, this indicates either a global increase in organic carbon burial or CO2 release. So essentially, let me show an example of this on the graph so this makes sense. We can see that during the Great Oxidation Event, which occurred like 2.4 billion years ago, when oxygen rose in levels because photosynthesizing organisms first evolved and they started pumping out oxygen, these photosynthesizing organisms took up so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and did so preferentially taking up carbon-12 instead of 13, that they greatly increased the amount of carbon-13 in the atmosphere and other systems left over for inorganic carbon-containing material like carbonates to form with. So when they took up all that light carbon, the inorganic carbonate material became super heavy or super high in carbon isotope ratios. So we had a carbon isotope excursion, a positive carbon isotope excursion, or essentially just an increase in heavy carbon isotopes found in the carbonate material due to this huge photosynthetic uptake of the lighter carbon at the time. And because we know how this works, we know that was one of the causes of the Great Oxidation Event. And likewise, negative carbon isotope excursions, or essentially very light carbon isotope ratios, will be seen in these inorganic materials during periods of major CO2 release from the burning of organic carbon from, for example, major volcanic events, like at the end Permian, with the greatest extinction event of all time that was with major volcanism that caused it. And with currently, we're currently burning organic fossil fuels, which have light carbon, very light carbon isotopes in them, and releasing that in mass amounts to the atmosphere. And that's causing lighter carbonates, inorganic carbon containing rocks to form. And so in the rock record millions of years from now, we're going to see a negative isotope excursion or light isotope signature in these inorganic carbon rocks. So all that is to say, why does that matter for looking for life on other worlds? Well, let me start with an example with Earth. So we can actually apply this understanding of carbon isotopes to ancient life on Earth, the first life on Earth, actually. There is a graphite formation of rocks called the Ushua Formation in Greenland that has very light carbon isotope ratios, which some have interpreted to mean that originally photosynthetic life contributed to the formation of these rocks. And so that would, at 3.9 billion years old, be the oldest evidence for life on Earth. Now, that is to say, the more robust fossil evidence with cyanobacterial mats and stromatolites is found at about 3.5 billion years ago. So that's kind of the standard of what we use as the first life on Earth. But it is possible that these chemical proxies in this graphite formation, this light carbon isotope signature, does indicate earlier life, earlier photosynthetic life on Earth. And no, we can't really say that for certain without the fossils and for the fact that the graphite is slightly, altered, but it's a possible signature that could possibly mean life. And it's something that we can apply to other worlds. For example, Titan and Enceladus. We can look for such signatures in their carbon material. Why? Well, these are both moons of Saturn, both with ice-covered liquid water oceans. Titan does have liquid methane oceans at its surface and ice methane and all of that, but it does also have liquid water ocean underneath a bunch of other ice layers. But it has a lot of carbon materials that we could look for certain carbon isotope preferences, isotope fractionation patterns that might indicate life. Likewise, Enceladus has, well, its major feature that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is it has these very obvious plumes at its south pole. And it's mainly water ice with a liquid water ocean underneath. But what's really important about these plumes is two major things. They might indicate, one, hydrothermal activity at the seafloor, which again might help basically feed chemicals into the ocean that life can use to harness energy. And two, because this hydrothermal activity or proposed hydrothermal activity at Enceladus's seafloor, this drives these plumes at the South Pole, which, because they're spewing out material from, theoretically the ocean, beneath the ice crust, we can sample it, which is great, and we have. And it turns out that it contains molecular hydrogen, CO2, methane, and other organics. And the organics, yes, can form abiotically, so there's, you have to make sure you don't read too far into that. But what's really incredible about this plume material is it contains CO2 and molecular hydrogen, which is a metabolic redox pair. In other words, a pair of reactants that can be put together by life and used to harness energy by producing methane and water. This is actually the exact reaction that a microbe called methanogens uses on Earth. And so it could be possible that the methane produced and seen in the plumes of Enceladus could be produced by life, by these similar microbes like the ones we have here on Earth that use this energy creating reaction. So how do we know if the methane on Enceladus is biotic or abiotic, is produced by life or not? Oh yeah, this is where we can put the first poll question. There isn't a right answer, but they can use it.
Don't say
So
that. You never
yeah.
know.
So this question is essentially what I'm asking in the poll question, but one paper, let's see if my mouse is going to work. Oh, here we go. One 2021 paper suggests that out of 3 separate scenarios on Enceladus, a biotic scenario in which it's both habitable and it is inhabited by methanogen like, oh, here we go. Yes, microbial life. Oh yeah, I'd like to think so too. I'd like to think that there is microbial life. Well, I'm about to tell you why there might be and what we can do to study certain things on Earth that might help us answer this question. But yeah, so out of 3 scenarios in which biotic, the methane is produced by life, abiotic and habitable, so it's not inhabited by methanogen type life, but it is habitable, or abiotic completely and not habitable. Out of these 3 scenarios, this paper suggests through modeling that the biological methane scenario is actually the most likely for Enceladus, assuming that an origin of life event, or the probability of an origin of life event, is over 35% under such habitable conditions. So essentially, this is a really important point because it tells us that the likelihood of alien life, or at least life on Enceladus, depends on the likelihood of an origin of life event. And unfortunately, we know incredibly little about the one known origin of life event that is our own. So we really don't know exactly where, how, or how long the origin of life on Earth took. So we can judge whether an environment can support life as we know it or is habitable, but we can't necessarily judge whether an environment can support an origin of life event, since we just don't know the parameters that support these types of events. What we do know or have hypothesized about Earth's origin of life is that it might have occurred at a hydrothermal vent like a deep hydrothermal vent, just like those that we hypothesize to be present in Enceladus's ocean, or it may have occurred at the surface with the need of both wet and dry cycles. Unfortunately, a surface origin of life, at least in Enceladus's current state, is not possible. So if we were to study Earth's origin of life a bit more and figure out whether, a hydrothermal vent scenario is possible and get more evidence that supports that, that would lend more evidence to support the possibility of life on Enceladus and in its oceans. So if we knew where Earth's origin of life took place, we'd be able to say with a lot more certainty whether Enceladus has the potential for life. Likewise, we also don't know the age of Enceladus or how long its ocean has persisted. And with that, we also don't know how long an origin of life event takes or needs. And so we need to know this in order, or it would be helpful to know this to better say whether Enceladus has been around long enough to host life, to even have an origin of life. All we know about Earth is that it took from 4.5 to 3.5-ish billion years ago. So the more that we narrow this, the more that we study ancient life on Earth, the more we can say with more certainty what moons and planets in our solar system and elsewhere might have life. So not only does studying Earth's past and origin of life event help us for predicting life on other worlds, but also looking for life on other worlds is helpful for studying Earth's origin of life. Because if you think about it, if we do find other life in our solar system, this could provide a whole second data point, or doubling our data that we have on origin of life events. And that could provide us a lot of info about our own origin of life. One example of this is if we found DNA-based life, or life very similar to Earth, that might suggest a panspermia scenario. In other words, a scenario in which there was a singular origin of life, but that life spread to multiple places in our solar system through transport, through asteroids or meteors or whatever it might be, spacecrafts. And so that brings us to our next poll question, which is, I think it's something like, do you think if there's if there's extraterrestrial life in our solar system, do you think it came from the same origin as Earth life in a panspermia scenario, or a separate origin? I feel like this is, it depends on where we find life too. Because if it's in the outer solar system, I feel like panspermia is a lot less likely. Whereas if it's like Mars, and it's very similar to ours, it would be really hard to say that those were separate, or say that we didn't just transport that there from Earth.
Yeah, really great questions. I'm very curious to see how this one goes.
Yeah, I'm always just so surprised at all the links that we go to, or like NASA goes to make sure that life is not transported anywhere. Because you'd think like nothing could survive any trips like that, but life is crazy.
Yes. Okay, let me share this.
Oh wow, pretty even spread. Yeah. Yeah, I think it all depends. I mean, it's so difficult to say without having the life in hand and being like, okay, it's DNA, it's carbon, it's what, I mean, it's probably going to be carbon, but like, yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. Okay. Okay, so last section or tool that we use to study Earth's past is biological proxies, biological signatures in the rock record. And if you just think to yourself, okay, what's a signature, a biological signature in Earth rocks that we use to study past biology? Obviously, the answer is fossils. Unfortunately, the normal macrofossils that we think of as fossils in Earth rocks aren't necessarily applicable to studying life on other worlds yet. Maybe at some point we'll find macrofossils, which would be great. But what's a little bit more applicable to studying life on other worlds, especially microbial life, are biomarkers and biosignatures. So one example of a biosignature is that carbon-12 or light carbon isotope signature that we talked about earlier that might indicate photosynthetic life. That could be, applied to ancient life on Earth, like the first life on Earth, but also if we, for example, found very preferentially light carbon in the plumes of Enceladus, that could indicate potentially photosynthetic or methanogenic life there. And so that's a biosignature. So we've kind of covered that. But biomarkers are more direct indicators of life, but they're often less robust and more rarely preserved. This is because they're organic molecules, but they're very resistant to organic molecules, and they're unique to specific organisms or groups of organisms. They're preserved in sediment after the organism has disintegrated, and their abundance, on Earth at least, is often used as a proxy for past distributions and abundances of the source organisms. For example, steroids and hopanoids are the common groups or major buckets that we put biomarkers into, steroids being things for like big multicellular animals, and hopanoids are resistant organic molecules that are in certain bacteria, lichens, ferns, trees, and fungi. And their structures differ depending on different taxa, different groups. Like certain bacteria have certain structures of hopanoids and others have others. So we can get really specific when the structures are preserved well enough to get specific, and that can identify the presence of very specific types of organisms in Earth's past. And so we can also use this to look at the rocks and see if there are any such biomarkers in the rocks of other worlds and whether those might indicate certain groups of organisms. For example, for biosignatures, like I mentioned, if we see light carbon isotopes in the rocks or the plumes of Enceladus, that could indicate the presence of life. Or if we found hopanoid structures in Enceladus's rocks or ocean or wherever, this could even be more robust evidence for the presence of at least microbial life. So these are really great for looking for life on other worlds. But in either case, the level of certainty that such signatures indicate for the presence of life relies on our understanding of how they form, which we can only glean from studying those proxies and how they form in Earth's modern and ancient systems. So in other words, Earth is our laboratory on which to study how to explore the universe. And that's why I'm so passionate about Earth science, because it can be applied to so many things. And that was where I was going to end the talk. But because of recent news, I wanted to add a few slides about the recent moon landing, which is super exciting. So we discussed moons of Saturn and Jupiter, but what about our own? Well, excitingly, Intuitive Machines just successfully landed the spacecraft Odysseus on the south pole of the moon. Why do we care about the South Pole? Well, the moon's South Pole has been and remains a focal point for space exploration for a while due to its water availability. NASA, and anybody who, has a space organization wants to establish a presence on the moon, especially at its South Pole due to its water availability. And this water is frozen. It's frozen water, but it's still water. And this is because there are deep craters at the moon's South Pole that are deep enough and angled a certain way in some of their crevices where water has remained frozen and out of direct sunlight for potentially millions to even billions of years, which is not only incredible because it could provide us insight into the ancient conditions of the moon, which is already really cool, but it can also act as a water source for humans that we've sent to the moon, or coolant for equipment, or potentially most interesting to space agencies, it can help us produce rocket fuel, which essentially means this could become like our go-to space exploration gas station, which is a far out idea, but really, really important because how much fuel it takes us to get just to our moon and out of our orbit is a lot. And so essentially, this can not only be used for lunar missions, but also to get to those moons that we were talking about in this talk. So yeah, our moon doesn't likely have life or even ancient life, but it might help us to get to the outer solar system moons that might have the potential for life, because then we can just stop at our moon and grab some gas, which is a really really cool thing to think about. But yeah, obviously far in the future. But this first landing that we've just had, the soft landing, I mean, I think it fell over if I'm not mistaken, but it's a good step. It's a great step. So it's really promising, and now we can start to search for those places with water and get an understanding of their distribution and how we can tap into that. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rachel Phillips. If you don't mind just not sharing your screen so we can see you properly, and then we'll,
Oh, yeah.
yes. Well, thank you so much. What a brilliant, beautiful talk. So everybody, I put Dr. Phillips's YouTube link in there. Really brilliant and such a beautiful angle. I'm just going to ask you one question, then I'll hand it over to the audience. It was so inspiring what you've been talking about. So what is interesting, of course, you mentioned these hydrothermal vents. And I
Mm,
remember very well in the, so what is sort of the late 80s where the hypothesis was first proposed, which is quite late if you think about it. All this idea that life could originate because you need some kind of heat, right? Would originate from hydrothermal vents came as a complete surprise.
yeah.
So, and you were talking a lot about the moons and so on, which is so interesting. So if you look, for example, at one of these crazy moons of Neptune, right? Triton. Okay. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
also, I mean, Triton is crazy because it's so far out and there seems to be volcanic activity there too, or heat.
Yeah.
And mm, I don't know what you think about this because I'm not a geologist. I know there are a lot of controversies in what I'm going to say now. But do you think it's possible that maybe radioactive decay, which also produces heat, could also be a source for energy and therefore maybe some reaction for life? What do you think about that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think, it's funny because everything that I've read about these outer worlds, I'm trying to think because also, so when our solar system formed, right, we have the heavier elements kind of came and were in the closer to the sun, and then the lighter, more volatile ones were sent out to the outer solar system, which why there's so much water and stuff there and ice. So I feel like I don't know how much they would contribute. Whenever I read about these moons, they really just focus on the tidal heat, so the tidal stretching for the huge gravitational pulls of Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune. So I I have no idea.
It's just an interesting idea. It may, but because, yeah, I mean, radioactive decay can take a long time, and that could actually produce heat, and
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be. I mean, we have so much radioactivity on Earth. People always get so crazy about radioactivity, but we have it all around us. So it's
It's funny too though, like clearly it could produce heat and that could help with
yes,
hydrothermal stuff. But honestly, with how huge
how huge
the
it would have to be,
the
right?
the planets are that are pulling
Yeah, right.
pulling them
Is more
gravitationally.
relevant. Is more
I just
relevant.
don't think that it need. I mean, if we look at like Io, like the volcanic moon of Jupiter, like
Yes.
it's so volcanically
Yeah.
active. Like we just don't need the radioactivity.
Yes.
So hot already. I mean, the icy moons aren't as hot as Io, but it's clearly possible to drive incredible volcanic activity, even with just the plumes on Enceladus. But yeah, there could be life on Titan, Enceladus, Europa. I'm like in the I think it's probably I'm like
Right.
it seems
And
so likely to me. It seems like why it has
yes,
to be.
yes. No, it makes complete sense. And that brings us to the questions now. So please put all your questions into the Q&A and I'll take them up. So Asko's asking the first question. I think tectonics on Earth are mainly internal. In Europa, they are mainly due to, you just mentioned it, to Jupiter's gravity. What are the main differences?
Oh, hold on, my screen is doing something weird.
That's okay.
Let me
Oh, you got a problem. Okay. Okay.
hold on just 1 second. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I think that is such a great point because Yeah, Europa. So if we think about tectonics on Earth, they're driven by convection in the mantle, which is driven by internal heat of Earth, which is, heat from formation and radioactive decay of elements in Earth's interior. And then the outer parts, the surface of Earth is heated by the sun. Our tidal heat, our stretching, our pull from things like the sun and our moon is very minimal. So that's something that provides us very little energy. Whereas moons like Europa and Io and all the moons of Jupiter and Saturn are mainly heated by tidal stress, so gravitational pull and stretching of moon or of the planets Jupiter and Saturn that they revolve. So they are more, I would say, externally heated. That said, like we see with the hydrothermal activity and the volcanism, I don't know if it changes much in terms of the results of the activity. It's just really the source of that activity that I think differs, internal versus external. But I think in terms of the actual activity that's going on, the tectonics, I'm not sure okay, well, that said, with Europa, it does change it because it's external, it depends on the ice thickness because, if it's all external, it's just stretching and stuff, and we've got cracks forming, that doesn't mean that it's getting down all the way to the ocean. So that does matter with respect to Europa. But if it is completely, separating the ice, and we do see like the dilation bands, and if we are interpreting them correctly, then it might not matter in terms of where the energy comes from that drives the tectonics. But it might matter in the sense that if the ice is too thick, then, it's too thick. So we don't
Thank
know the
you.
answer.
By the way, you're getting so many positive comments. I just want to tell you on the
Oh,
webinar.
thank you guys.
And thanks for everyone too for listening and putting these kind comments, and we really appreciate it. Eric, who's a big fan of your YouTube channel, I saw that already, is says, did you see the recent study about potential subsurface oceans on some dwarf planets? He said, I forget which ones, I'm sorry, but did you
Oh,
see
I have not. I have
that?
not. That's I have only really looked deeply into like the moons like Triton, Enceladus, Europa. I have not looked into dwarf planets, but I hope to at some point. Pluto
We'll
seems,
have more than you, more stuff to talk about.
yeah, I need to look more into this.
Okay, Edwin, is life possible without photosynthesis? That's exactly your question. Yes, that's not the case on Europa. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no yeah, because there's an ice crust.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So yeah, there's two kind of stem types of life on Earth that we see that drive ecosystems. There are ecosystems at the surface of Earth, like our own ecosystem, where photosynthesizing organisms get energy from the sun and they make organic carbon, which we then eat, or we eat things that eat them, and that drives the entire ecosystem. And so they're making the food for us, and they originally get that energy from the sun. But there's a whole second type of what we call autotroph, thing that makes their own food, that drives ecosystems in the very depths of Earth's ocean, where we have deep hydrothermal vents, just like, things analogous to potentially what's on Enceladus. And in these systems, what's driving the initial formation of organic carbon and food is the microbes that get chemicals from the hydrothermal vent fluid. So the energy from chemicals from below, from internal, from within Earth, are coming up in underwater volcanoes into the ocean, and that's chemically driving the formation of energy, and these microbes are harnessing that, and then bigger tube worms and whatnot, and like whole ecosystems are taking advantage of that deep in the ocean where there's no light getting through and there's no photosynthesizers. So absolutely, it's possible. It's happening on Earth. It's called chemosynthesis, so it's just not photo. And that is the life that we're kind of looking for when we think about these ice covered moons, because obviously there's not photosynthesis going, there's not light. One, sunlight is already traveling so far to get to the outer solar system, so it's very dim. And two, the ice is covering it, so there's no photosynthesis. But there could absolutely be chemosynthesis, and those would be the life organisms that we're looking for, which is another reason we think they're probably more microbial or small than large macroorganisms like ourselves.
Yeah, and somebody, they seem to know that you spent a lot of time in the lab, Dr. Phillips. So here's a question from John. Have you had the opportunity to examine the samples of rock from Bennu asteroid?
No, oh, I wish. Most of my lab work was very Earth based. I didn't even look at Earth rocks. I formed them or mock formed them to figure out how they formed on ancient Earth. So I did very little work with actual real life field samples, and if I ever did, it was very much Earth based. But I don't know. Maybe in the future I'll look at some asteroid samples. That'd be amazing. Yeah, that'd be really cool.
And here comes a very complimentary comment from Ari. He says, Hi, Rachel. I have a PhD in cellular and molecular biology, University of Georgia in 1988. I loved your talk. I wish you all the best in your postdoc and entire career. Well, we can
Oh,
only
thank
agree with that.
you.
Very kind, and I completely agree with that. Ian, thinking about this, can we consider that the Earth will or has gone through a landmass cycle? Oh, okay, here we go.
A landmass cycle. Like meaning that we've cycled through all the
Yes, I think that's what he means. Yes, yes. Like
interesting.
supercontinents and so on. I think that's probably where the question's
Oh,
coming
like
from. Yes,
supercontinents.
that's
Okay.
how many there are and what and could there have been life before life? I think this is where it's going. I may be wrong, but
Oh.
yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't really know. I mean, we've certainly had, supercontinents come together and separate. The actual like continental land masses have kind of been the same for ever since they formed because they don't subduct; they're too buoyant. But ocean crust has subducted and been recycled and gone through cycles many times in Earth's history. But at the same time, that hasn't, with the exception of the formation of supercontinents and kind of changing climate, that hasn't directly affected life too much in the way of life on Earth. But yeah, I don't know enough about what you mean by landmass cycle,
I
but that's
think, yeah,
interesting.
I think Rachel, what he's implying, the very first slide that you put on this very,
Mm.
this, what was it, graphite or this very ancient rock. I don't remember what it
Oh
was.
yeah.
Yeah, where it could have gone so far back. So the question is maybe, could there have been life before life? And maybe this is just a second or third cycle that we're going through. Is that even possible?
Oh. Oh,
That's
I have no idea. That's beyond that's beyond my knowledge. I don't know.
that's a great question,
That's a
honestly.
great question. You should research that. Whoever asked that. I don't know.
Okay, Barrett is asking, is there research or analysis of proxies for life outside our solar system? If so, it would be, is it even relevant given the extreme distance and evolution of life? Yes.
I would say one great question. I would say again, have only really read about moons and planets in our solar system, so I don't have that much knowledge about this. But absolutely, I would say yeah, it's relevant because all the elements kind of repeat themselves and come together in very similar ways in other solar systems, at least to our knowledge, depending on the type of solar system. I'm sorry, there's a car alarm going off. But anyway, so yeah, the rocks are still there. There's still, chunks of rock in space that we can go look in to look for proxies. I mean, the proxies by definition, like the types of physical, chemical, and biological proxies, we can still go look for no matter where the rock is in or outside of our solar system. And so absolutely, I think it's relevant. But it just takes a lot more just remote understanding of what's out there before we can even like be like, okay, this is the type of thing that's there. Because like, even in our own solar system, there's, I think we were talking about this before we started, what, 100, how many moons in our solar system?
Well, there are 206 at the moment.
200,
That's
yeah,
what one knows, 206 moons.
over 200 moons in our solar system, and we're focused on like less than 10. So, we'd have to do a lot of pre-work to determine which places we'd want to go like sample and stuff. But yeah, it's absolutely relevant. I don't know that much about it, but I would think it's relevant.
Next question, Eric. What is your favorite
Oh,
candidate for potential life in our solar system? That's a good
that's
one.
a difficult question. It's like asking my favorite child,
Okay.
my favorite pet. Like, I don't know. But I would say I love how I'm like, I don't know, and then I like have an answer. Um, I used to say Europa to this answer, but the more that I read
And
about Enceladus, I
I thought
just
so.
find it so intriguing. But then
Mhm.
there's also like the potential for like really weird life on like
Yes,
Titan, but I don't
yes,
know
that's
about it
right.
or understand it to like be like yeah, I don't know, but I want to go to all of them.
Okay, but if you had one choice, they would give you a rocket and you say, Rachel will give you a safe flight. Which one would it be? That's maybe Eric's question. Where do you want to fly?
I would put it. I would go with Enceladus
Yes.
because I know
Okay,
that we're going to Europa
right.
soon. So I'm like, okay, well, let's. Yeah.
True,
So
true. Good
yeah, I
point.
would just go hit all the others.
That's very wise. That's a very wise choice. Well done. Okay, Herbert is saying, do you know of space missions to, here we go, to Enceladus in the near future to clarify the question? That's,
I don't know. I
oh,
don't know
no,
for Enceladus. I know
no.
for Europa.
No.
But we've also got, didn't we have oh, what's it called? Going to Titan. So maybe since they're close by, they'll stop by Enceladus. I don't know.
Yes, they were. Yes.
There's so many potential. I don't know. I feel like Enceladus is unfortunately like not on like a dedicated mission
Mm.
list in the near future, but it might be like a side quest to Titan or something. I think that's what 2027. I don't
Right.
remember.
Somewhere around there. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
At
That's
least that was what they always push it back. But and Europa is like soon, I feel like, but I don't think it's scheduled to get there to like in the
yeah,
2030s.
of course.
So
Yes.
yeah, but yeah, that I mean that's the soonest that I know to any of these moons that I talked about. But that it for outer solar system, that's pretty soon. So I would say that's pretty exciting.
Great questions. Next one. Dennis, can we compare snowball Earth situation with ice-covered oceans on moons?
That
Okay.
is such an amazing question. Okay, so he's talking about the snowball Earth. So these were these huge, like nearly global glaciation events that happened on ancient Earth, like over a billion, or well, less, a little bit less than a billion years ago. And yeah, it's almost like Earth was covered in its own ice shell. We think now that it wasn't fully covered, but absolutely, you can kind of think of this as like being relevant to the current scenarios in the outer solar system. The only major difference would be the thickness. I mean, we still had surface hydrological cycles, we think, going on even with most of the Earth covered in ice, but it was much thinner, and even many of the places allowed sunlight through for photosynthesis, and so life was still on Earth mainly driven by sunlight, and that was the main thing, heating Earth, and providing Earth energy as it has been throughout the time. So the major difference is energy is driven by the tidal forces rather than the sun, and the ice is way thicker.
Yes.
But yeah, unfortunately, it's just yeah. It would be so nice to think that this is just a blip of time in those moons' history, but given the thickness of the ice, it's probably been like this for a while.
Right. Dean is saying, can any of these biosignatures or biomarkers be detected remotely with spectroscopic lines? If so, that requires the material, rock or ocean water to be heated or vaporized or something. Yeah, good point. Yes,
That's an amazing question.
it
I
is.
absolutely don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like probably, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question.
I can answer
Good question.
that.
But he's absolutely right. You need heat, at least.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, George. What can you tell us where tectonics are happening on planets in far off systems? Okay, so maybe
Oh,
at the
like
exoplanet,
EXO.
exoplanets.
I have no idea.
They, you know, that's probably still fiction at this, as far as I know, because I mean, also exomoons, for example, have been hypothesized, but no one as far as I know, has discovered exomoons. You know, they've not been confirmed. It's just
Yeah,
we don't have the sensitivity.
hypothesis.
So that probably answers your question on tectonics too. It's just too far off still.
Yeah, I'm sure that someone's hypothesized that,
Yes.
but it's so hard to tell anything. You're just kind of looking at like light that slightly dims every now and then, and you're like, there's something there. It's not
But
something
from
you
the
can go
from the
image.
prob, talking about the probability, as we said, we have 206 moons. We've at least 5 to 10 interesting moons. If you take that, it's 10 to 20% interesting. If you extrapolate that to all the stars or even nearby, just in our surrounding galaxy, I mean, my goodness, look, there should be quite a high probability of something very interesting going on there, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you think about just probability and math,
It's,
like,
it's
it's, yeah, absolutely. There's tectonically active worlds out there. We just got to go find them.
Oh, and Eric's a big fan here. He says, I really love this presentation. Do you think you'll do more of these? And you're
Oh, invite me
very,
back. I will
you're
absolutely.
so welcome. Really, really, Dr. Phillips, you're most welcome. Absolutely loved your presentation here. And
Thanks
there
a
was
lot.
somebody else in the audience who suggested, and I completely agree, you should go and give a TED talk. Really. And
Oh my gosh. That's like, oh God,
you
that's like a
are,
dream.
I think you will absolutely get there. I have no doubt. Absolutely no.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot.
And Natalia, final question here. Thanks a lot for this fantastic talk. What do you expect from Europa
Europa
Clippers
Clippers.
mission? Yes, that's right. That's
To my understanding, I'm actually looking it up right now because I can't remember what they plan to do, but they're not like, you know, the dream obviously is to get down into the ocean, but we're not going to be doing that. I can't remember if they're just doing are they doing a flyby or an orbiter? I can't remember, but they're not getting down into where I would wish that they
wish
could
they
go,
would.
for
Yes,
example,
like
the
Mars, right? That would be nice.
yeah, because
Yeah.
like, Europa doesn't have as strong of there's some places where there's hypothesized plumes, but they're not as strong and consistent and location and strength as Enceladus, so we can't like go directly to a place on Europa and sample plumes. I actually I could be completely wrong about what Europa Clipper mission's doing. I can't remember. I read about
Yeah,
it like
Natalia saying in the chat is just flyby. That's what I thought. Yes, yes.
yeah, yeah. So, it's not going to be you can't really sample the ocean, which is a little sad. But I
Mm.
think obviously we're going to be able to again look at those physical structures at the surface and get a way better understanding of whether the ice is actually fully splitting and allowing new material up to the surface, which again is super important for the cycles that might allow life because it is if it's fully, cycling with the deep liquid water ocean, that's the part that, we need to know. And that is something we could figure out by getting a closer look at the physical surface. So that's absolutely something that I would hope that the mission aims to do, since we can't touch down and like go sample it.
And that's a very good point now to finalize your wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Rachel Phillips, for this so inspiring talk. And as I was just mentioning, I was just mentioning this to Dr. Phillips. Go and watch the film Naiad if you want to see something very inspiring about somebody who's got, um, you know, uh, what you can do with your life. So it's called NYAD. And if you've never not seen this movie, go and have a look at it. I was very inspired by it. And Dr. Phillips, I hope you'll be back again and we'll be watching for your Geo channel. I put the link out there. Thank you everyone for your wonderful questions that you make this so lively and possible and so inspiring. Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful weekend and we're going to spring. Okay. Bye everyone. Bye.
Thank you.